broader, where things that don't work get pushed aside and things that work go forward. You know, products that work succeed, products that don't work don't. And I think that what happened at the time of the creation of Bretton Woods, there was this very clear, you know, that mathematical microeconomics was on the rise, but everybody who did it knew that it didn't quite work when you applied it to the overall economy. And so you had this increasingly sophisticated and mathematical sort of economics dealing with micro issues, and macro remained this kludgy Keynesian thing about basically flows of this going there and the other way, and it wasn't based on any sort of foundation of rational man or anything like that. It was just an attempt to model how the world actually worked. And so, I mean, one of the fascinating things that I learned about reading the book is clearly there was ideological freight to it, but I think for a lot of these people, it was just these young grad students learning all these cool new ways that they could manipulate theories and numbers, and wondering, well, why am I only allowed to do that for these questions and not for these questions? And why do we have this beautiful construct of rational decision making and we only bring it this far, we don't bring it to explain the whole world? And that's very Robert Lucas, who's the guy behind, you know, probably the most major force behind where macroeconomics went, starting in the 1970s. That's totally how he explained it. It's just, I was just trying to take the theories of Paul Samuelson and apply them, you know, make them apply to everything. And the problem is, I think just what's so clear from the experience is the truths you learn at the micro level don't apply at the macro level in economics. And I don't think economists have really dealt with that at all, because I think people in macro are very defensive right now. I mean, Tom Sargent and Chris Sims winning the Nobel this year, and I don't know Sims very well, but Sargent is very much completely of this world where the whole idea is let's start with people with rational expectations and try to build a model of the whole economy. And Sargent would admit that these models don't explain much, but he still thinks it's the only game in town. And I you know, Robert Skidelsky, the biographer who wrote this great three-volume biography of Keynes, he had a book that came out a couple years ago, and his big argument was in the future no one should be allowed to get a degree in macroeconomics unless they take history classes and sociology classes and psychology classes and lots of other things, which I'm sure would be good for your business. But I can't imagine that's happened here at Columbia. One thing that is happening is there are a lot of young grad students studying financial crises, which at least is something, which wasn't happening before because there wasn't one. Well, actually, there were lots to study, but they weren't here in the U.S. So,
imagine if the Nobel Prize for Medicine was given to someone whose work began on the assumption that cancer is impossible. This is what is happening in economics. Sargent and others before him built whole glimmering careers on mathematical models whose primary hidden axiom, but nevertheless there, otherwise the model doesn't work, you cannot solve it mathematically, is that there can never be a crisis, that a crisis is impossible.
Well, and this reminds me, there's this wonderful moment early in the creation of modern academic finance, which is very much along the same lines as what Sargent has done, where Franco Modigliani and Merton Miller were trying to solve this problem in finance. And they just said, you know, we know there have been bubbles and crashes and such, but for the purposes of this particular problem, let's assume them away. It's just to solve this problem, let's assume them away. And what you saw is within 10 years, they were assumed away for the purposes of answering all problems.
Look, the way to understand the economics profession, firstly, it's not science, it's a religion with equations. Let's get this straight. And I say this as somebody who made a career out of being, as I said before, a mathematical economist. So I think I have some credence in saying this. Now, from the 1870s, prior to the 1870s, there were no economists. Adam Smith was a moral philosopher, Karl Marx was a revolutionary, David Ricardo was a landowner who also bought himself a seat in the House of Commons in order to lambast his own political class. John Stuart Mill was what John Stuart Mill was. Professionalization of economics came together with mathematization for a very, very simple reason. The way to convince presidents of universities, chancellors, and so on, that a chair in economics was important and should be instituted was to say, we are to society what physicists are to nature, scientists. Now, because they were not particularly inventive people, they simply copied the rule book of physics, of 19th century physics, which is what? You start with a grand axiom, you build a mathematical model, you work out theorems from it, and then in physics you go to the lab to find out if it's right or not. In economics there is no lab, so if enough people believe it, it's true. Okay? That current of economics was always part of the ecology of the economics profession. There were always these economists hanging around. Now, the thing with economic models, with mathematical economic models, is that they are notoriously difficult to solve. We have in mathematical economics what's called the problem of indeterminacy. It's like having a system of two equations with four unknowns. You have to make assumptions in order to solve it, right? There are too many unknowns. So, you need certain assumptions. Some of them have to be hidden because they look very iffy in order to close the model. Now, there were always these people who were playing with these models, and some of these models are extremely aesthetically pleasing. I mean, I've spent months and months working on these models, knowing full well that they are completely irrelevant, but nevertheless, like chess is irrelevant, it's still a nice game. And it's also very good for the mind. So if you don't believe your own rhetoric from your mathematical models, they can be fun and very useful, you know, as intellectual exercises. The problem started with the collapse of Bretton Woods. Because at that point, the perfect storm was created. Two historical forces met. On the one hand, you had the financialization drive, which required mathematical models that were utilized in order to prefigure the value of these derivatives. Now, these models had to be solved, and axioms had to be made. And the only way of solving them and say this CDO is worth $1,000 was by introducing the standard assumption that there will be no crisis. Because if you allow for a crisis to happen inside your modeling, the mathematics is indeterminate. And then you can't solve it, and you can't pinpoint a value for the derivative. So suddenly, the economists who were always making a career out of those beautiful, aesthetically pleasing models, suddenly became a hot commodity in the world of finance. And as political goods were devalued, and financial goods were revalued, those economists in the good universities like yours here, who were producing these equilibrium models, as we call them, models that are solvable and result in equilibria, suddenly got all the research grants. They got to choose who gets appointed. They had all the nice, cozy links with the financial sector. And because the financial sector was also determining who is running the Fed and who was running the regulatory authorities to a very large extent, there was a lot of coziness in the relationship between academic economists, the banks, and the government. And those who said, hang on, guys, this axiom of yours is idiotic, they simply didn't get tenure.
Well, because this is just reminding me so much of this story, wonderful story from the mid-'80s when Bob Shiller, who I think he already had tenure before he started doing this work, he wrote this famous paper in about '81 just pointing out that the stock market price movements were a lot more volatile than any underlying data he could find about the companies on the market. So he's simply saying, well, gee, markets seem to be a lot more volatile than the underlying economy, and therefore markets aren't efficient or rational or whatever else. And Robert Merton, who went on to win the Nobel that immediately embarrassed the Nobel Committee because a few months later, long-term capital management, where he's a partner, collapsed. He
collapsed, requiring a multi-billion-dollar infusion from the U.S. taxpayer, right? Not just collapsed.
We're here to help. Merton's response was this wonderful. He said, you know, if Shiller's right, you know, this entire edifice we built collapses. It doesn't work. You know, our whole option pricing theory, derivatives, efficient market, none of it works if Shiller's right. So why don't we turn the question around? And, you know, financial market prices are the most transparent, easily measured things in the world. Maybe the problem is with all the other measures.